We talked about why that $50 million increase in government spending on space shuttles would actually end up as a shift in aggregate demand by more than 50 million via the multiplier effect. Now we're going to talk about why it could end up being less than 50 million. And that would be via the crowding out effect. Okay, crowding out. How crowding out works is that when you've got that initial increase in government spending, that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right? It shifts it out. And that means GDP is increasing. But remember, all that spending on aggregate demand, that the components of aggregate demand, consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, right? All that spending flows around through, remember the circular flow model. That spending flows through as income. And so we've got an increase in income. I'll spell it out. I often use Y for income. So income rises. Now when income goes up, people will tend to want to spend some more of that income, and they will want to hold more of their wealth in the form of money. So they, instead of holding as much stocks and bonds to spend, they will hold more money. So here we have the money supply. Here we have money demand, quantity of money, and interest rates. Remember that? And with an increase in demand for money in response to the increase in income, interest rates will rise. And if interest rates go up, that means capital investment will go down. That is to say that the government increased spending here will crowd out capital investment there. So that last little bit, the decrease in investment will cause aggregate demand to fall. So what is the bigger impact? What's the bigger effect? Aggregate demand rising here in response to the increase in government spending, or aggregate demand falling here in response to the fall in investment? Well, if the economy is in a recession and there's a lot of unused capacity, the increase in government spending and the increase in aggregate demand will be much more powerful. In fact, crowding out over here would be very minimal in the case of unused capacity. However, if the economy is pretty much in long-run equilibrium, capacity is full, unemployment, full employment, right? All that. And if we had an increase in government spending, well, it could very well kick into gear this crowding out over here. Now, why government would be increasing spending in a time when the economy is fully employed at the long run, rate of output, there would be no reason for it, frankly. But, the party in power might want to gin up the economy a little bit before an election. You never know. They do those things sometimes. So not an issue if we're in a recession. Crowding out is just not a big deal. If the economy is at long run natural rate of employment and natural rate of output, crowding out could be an issue. The other way that government can stimulate aggregate demand is through taxation. So we've talked about increase in government spending, and that would increase aggregate demand. But another way to increase aggregate demand would be through lowering taxes. or raising taxes, depending on which way you want to go. So let's say they lowered the tax rate. That will give people more money to spend, right? I mean, when people get to keep more of their money, they're going to spend some of it, right? That's going to increase consumption, which will increase aggregate demand. Okay? If they raise taxes, that's going to leave people with less money. Consumption will fall, which means aggregate demand will fall. So through changing tax rates, they can manage aggregate demand. Now, it's important to note that the multiplier and crowding out effects are present here. So let's follow this through. Let's say they lower taxes. That increases consumption, which increases aggregate demand. Now, the multiplier effect is present. Yes, that does say a multiplier. That's present there. So when consumption goes up here, keep in mind the multiplier. Aggregate demand will go up by more than that via the multiplier. Now, with the increase in aggregate demand, income rises, which means money demand rises, which would cause interest rates to rise, which would cause capital investment to fall, which would cause aggregate demand to fall. And once again, let's see if I can write it better. That would keep in mind that the multiplier effect is engaged there as well. So we have, and then, so we've got the multiplier to deal with here and here, and we have crowding out. Taxes, lower taxes, increase consumption, can crowd out investment here. So, what is the relative size of the crowding out, change in aggregate demand? It could be actually bigger or smaller than the tax change that created it. Now, one thing for sure is that any attempt to manage aggregate demand via taxes has got to be perceived as permanent. If a tax cut, for example, is perceived as only temporary, people just aren't going to respond to it. They'll have a little extra money for a while, but they will be able to see that the taxes are going to go back up again. And experience has demonstrated that it just doesn't have much of an impact on aggregate demand. Now, there's a couple of interesting cases for that. During the 1960s, President Johnson had a lot going on. Lots of government spending on the war in Vietnam, and at the same time, more government spending with his war on poverty. Lots of programs were implemented at that time. So lots and lots of government spending, and aggregate demand was really going out of control. So what they wanted to do is rein in aggregate demand. They wanted to slow it down. They wanted to, generate some friction. Now, during World War II, they raised taxes and they had quotas. They rationed things so that extra, too many dollars chasing too few goods wasn't an issue. No such attempt during the 1960s. So just a lot of government spending, a lot of debt, And the fear was, this is where the money supply gets to become an issue. If the financing involves printing up money, you're going to have inflation. So, and inflation did heat up during this time. So what they did to try to rein in aggregate demand, kind of put the brakes on it, was they had a 10% tax surcharge. 1 year only. And everybody knew it was only 1 year. Well, everybody ignored it. The hope was that C would fall, consumption would fall. It didn't. People perceived that as like a bump in the road, and they kept on just like they always did. Because it was known it was temporary. Now, in 1992, the Bush administration did the same thing. Not exactly the same thing. They did the same thing in that it was known that it was temporary. 1992 was a very, very mild recession, and so they wanted to just do a little bit of fine-tuning there, just a little bit of stimulus. They didn't cut tax rates, but what they did is they reduced the withholding of the taxes. Now, whenever you get a paycheck, you'll notice some of your money has been withheld for taxes. That's so that, you won't get stuck with the whole bill when it's tax time. So if you withheld enough, you won't have any tax liability. If you withheld too little, you're going to have to send in a check. If you withheld too much, you're going to get a refund. Well, what they did is they reduced the withholding, hoping that would stimulate spending, stimulate consumption. So they wanted consumption to go up. Well, again, it was temporary. Since it was a temporary thing, people just weren't that dumb. They knew they still had to pay the full taxes in April, and they knew they'd better come up with some money because it wasn't being withheld. That means they better put it away themselves if they're smart, put it in a savings account. Well, of course they didn't increase spending. They knew that their tax bill was still due, and they were less was being withheld, and so again, it didn't do a thing.